torture chamber of popular myth never existed, even though this image was reprinted hundreds of times. And it was not only the use of torture that was falsified. Stories were also fabricated about the gruesome conditions in which prisoners were kept.
Ironically, the Inquisition had probably the best jails in Spain. This sounds very much like whitewashing, but unfortunately it's true. Let me take a quotation from the inquisitors in Barcelona in the middle of the 16th century, when they were asked to report on the state of their prisons, and they said, "Our prisons are full." But then they complained to their bosses in Madrid, "We don't know where to send the leftover prisoners we have. We cannot send them to the city jails, because the city jails are overcrowded, and there they are dying at the rate of 20 a week."
I have found instances of prisoners in secular criminal courts blaspheming in order to get into the Inquisition prison, to escape the maltreatment they received in the secular prison.
So, despite the compelling Gothic fictions of Montanus, the evidence leads us to a wholly different conclusion. The inquisitors were certainly interrogators, but they were restrained interrogators, skeptical about the effectiveness of hardship and torture in bringing heresy to light. By contrast with many other tribunals in Europe, they emerge as almost enlightened.
El caso más singular, por ejemplo, es el caso de la brujería. El Tribunal de Santo Oficio fue extraordinariamente benigno con el tema de la brujería, mientras que otras justicias europeas, justicias ordinarias y justicias eclesiásticas no tuvieron ni mucho menos la misma consideración con este tipo de delito.
Proclama mi alma la grandeza del Señor.
Whatever crime they were investigating, the inquisitors went by the book. The persecution of witches was a frenzy that swept through Europe for 300 years, between 1450 and 1750. At the merest accusations of a fantastical offense, sleeping with the devil or bearing his children, women were brutally tortured or burnt at the stake. The depravity of their alleged crimes was cited to justify this brutal response. One tribunal took a different approach.
Remember that the inquisitors were university lawyers, and lawyers look for evidence. So when the inquisitors looked for evidence of witchcraft, they said, okay, so this woman has killed a baby. Where is this baby? How many babies have died? And so on and so forth. And as they went through looking for the evidence, they found no evidence, because of course witchcraft was, we may presume, an imaginary offense.
While the rest of Europe reacted with horror, the Spanish Inquisition declared witchcraft a delusion. No one could be tried, let alone burnt for it. But it was the Spanish Inquisition that came to symbolize the ruthless persecution of heresy. Why? Because by the 1560s, Spain was more than just a power. It was a superpower. Its fitting symbol, the new royal palace, a 16th century pentagon built in the hills above Madrid, El Escorial. This vast structure, comprising miles of marbled corridors, was built by Charles V's son and successor, Philip II. Under Philip, Spain completed its rise within less than a century from isolation and obscurity to the domination of Europe. Philip was at the pinnacle of earthly power, but like his father Charles, he had a higher loyalty.
Before suffering the slightest damage to religion and the service of God, I would lose all my estates and 100 lives if I had them, because I do not wish nor do I desire to be the ruler of heretics.
Confronted by such fervour and strength, Spain's enemies changed tack. Their new target would be the king himself.
Philip II is an excellent example of the distortions and the creations, very successful creations in this case, of the Black Legend. Philip II was presented as a monster. That's an example of the cruelty of the Spanish race. Philip II really, his policies are perfectly debatable. Personally, I don't like him, but he was no more of a monster than, say, Henry VIII of England. And Henry VIII, nevertheless, was cleaned up in order to be presented as a fit champion of Protestantism.
Philip took no such trouble with the presentation of his image, believing it beneath his dignity. He paid dearly for it. In 1568, the year after Montanus was published, a chance incident played into the propagandist's hands. The king's son, Don Carlos, died suddenly. Suspicion lighted on Philip, and it was claimed that he had not acted alone.
Among the aspects of the Black Legend, which became very current in the 16th century onwards, was that the Inquisition had encouraged the King of Spain, Philip II, to kill his own son, to execute his own son, for reasons which the king knew best and which the inquisitors knew best. For this legend, of course, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever, or to be even more firm, it is totally false, totally unsubstantiated.
His son and heir, Don Carlos, was an insane, very problematic teenager who died in an accident. But Don Carlos became something like a champion of freedom, and he was the protagonist of many plays and dramas and novels in the 17th and 18th century, the most famous of which was by Schiller, later converted into a beautiful opera, by the way, by Giuseppe Verdi.
In Verdi's opera, Don Carlos declares before God his allegiance to Flanders, a Habsburg province ruled by his father the king, but with strong Protestant sympathies and by now seeking its independence. Defying his monstrous father, Don Carlos is portrayed as a heroic symbol of resistance, his mission to defeat the forces of repression. The next act opens with the king in an agony of doubt. Alone in his chambers at night, he ponders how to punish his errant son. His Christian conscience prevents him taking the most drastic step of all, until a visitor persuades him otherwise. The Grand Inquisitor, portrayed as an old blind man, listens as the king pours out his anguish. Then, through his uncompromising arguments, the Inquisitor gradually overcomes the king's reluctance and persuades him to kill his son. The Grand Inquisitor decides the issue by observing that there is a precedent. The opera is fiction from start to finish, and the most influential distortion concerns the Inquisition, which can come and go as it pleases here in Philip's private quarters at El Escorial, a malign spectral presence feared even by the king and manipulating affairs of state from behind his throne. The death of Don Carlos was a godsend for the mythmakers. In reality, the Inquisition was no more the power behind the throne than the inadequate